Hello and welcome to Indus News. I'm Meher Sher and you're watching me from Islamabad. Here are the headlines. In Myanmar, security forces have shot dead 9 protesters across the country. Witnesses and local media say police used tear gas to disperse demonstrators and later opened fire. Protesters have also gathered in Yangon and Mandalay, as well as several other cities. More than 220 people have been killed in the military crackdown since the February 1st coup. North Korea has announced a total severance of diplomatic relations with Malaysia. This comes after a Malaysian court ruled that a North Korean man could be extradited to the U.S. to face money laundering charges. In a statement, the Foreign Ministry said Malaysia committed a hostile act in subservience to U.S. pressure. Many EU states are to restart their rollout of their AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine after Europe's medicines regulator concluded it was safe and effective. But a previously healthy Swedish woman has died just a week after being inoculated. Here in Pakistan, the virus has claimed 40 lives and infected nearly 3,500 people overnight. The nationwide death toll has crossed 13,700. Globally, there are 2.6 million fatalities and more than 121 million cases so far. Air Chief Marshal Zahir Ahmed Babar Sidhu has taken charge of the Pakistan Air Force. He replaced Air Chief Marshal Mujahid Anwar Khan at the change of command ceremony at Air Headquarters in Islamabad. Speaking at the event, Khan said PAF lived up to the nation's expectations during Operation Swift Retort. A formation of JF-17 Thunder paid tribute to the outgoing Air Chief. Well, those were the headlines. More news in detail after a short break. Stay with us. Welcome back. And now for the news in more detail. We begin in Myanmar, where security forces have shot dead 9 protesters across the country. Witnesses and local media say police used tear gas to disperse demonstrators and later opened fire. Protesters have also gathered in Yangon and Mandalay, as well as several other cities. The media reported that authorities have arrested 2 more journalists, including a BBC reporter. Meanwhile, Indonesian President Joko Widodo has called for a high-level ASEAN meeting on the Myanmar crisis. During a virtual address, he urged to restore democracy and halt violence in the country. More than 220 people have been killed in the military crackdown since the February 1st coup. And North Korea has announced a total severance of diplomatic relations with Malaysia. This comes after a Malaysian court ruled that a North Korean man could be extradited to the U.S. to face money laundering charges. Pyongyang's foreign ministry said Malaysia committed a hostile act against North Korea in subservience to U.S. pressure. In a statement, the ministry said its citizens engaged in legitimate external trade activities in Singapore for years. The ministry said the incident proves Malaysian authority is no less than lawless riffraff. It added, now onwards, Malaysia will bear full responsibility for all consequences to be incurred between the two countries. It warned the U.S. will also pay a due price, calling it the backstage manipulator and the main culprit. Moving on, in Alaska, China and the U.S. have traded barbs at the first high-level talk since President Joe Biden took office. The foreign affairs chief of China's Communist Party, Yang Jiechi, told Washington to stop pushing its version of democracy on the world. He lashed out at U.S. hypocrisy for criticizing Beijing on human rights. Yang said the U.S. relies on its military and financial hegemony to maintain its long-armed jurisdiction against some countries, while United States Secretary Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the Biden administration is united with its allies in pushing back against China. He accused Beijing of increasing authoritarianism and assertiveness at home and abroad. The secretary said Beijing is threatening the rules-based order that maintains global stability. And now many EU states are set to restart their rollout of the Oxford-AstraZeneca COVID-19 vaccine after Europe's medicines regulator concluded it was safe and effective. But a previously healthy Swedish woman has died just a week after being inoculated. Globally, there are 2.6 million fatalities and more than 121 million cases so far. More details on the pandemic in this report. Vaccine skepticism continues to confuse laypersons and makes the fight against the virus more difficult. The Caribbean nation, Cuba, has approved a second homegrown COVID-19 vaccine for the late-phase trials. Meanwhile, the U.S. has announced plans to send 4 million doses of AstraZeneca's vaccine to Mexico and Canada in loan deals. This comes as President Joe Biden announced that the U.S. is about to hit his administration's target of 100 million vaccine administrations.
Tomorrow, we will hit 100 million doses our administration has administered. But I've always said, that's just the floor. We will not stop until we beat this pandemic. Next week, I will announce our next goal to put shots in arms.
In Europe, amid the AstraZeneca vaccine controversy, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark have decided to continue a pause on the Oxford drug. The EU has threatened to tighten vaccine exports as rifts over the scarcity of the shots deepened and the bloc struggled to obtain more deliveries. Britain's vaccine supply setback took a new turn after it emerged that India delayed sending 5 million doses to the country. Meanwhile, France has imposed a month-long lockdown on Paris after a faltering vaccine rollout and spread of highly contagious variants.
Facing an acceleration of the virus and the pressure that's increasing on our hospital systems, we owe it to ourselves. The time has come to implement more demanding measures in most critical situations. In these of Paris and northern France regions, new massive measures to restrain the epidemic will be in place for 4 weeks.
With nearly 40,000 new cases, India's daily infections have spiked to the highest level in more than 3 months. Meanwhile, Pakistan has registered another 40 deaths from COVID-19 overnight. The health ministry says this has pushed the toll to 13,757. The ministry says nearly 3,500 people tested positive for the virus in the last 24 hours. Pakistan's caseload has crossed 619,000, of which more than 578,000 people have recovered. The ministry said the number of active cases has crossed 27,000. The ministry said over 2,600 coronavirus patients have been admitted to hospitals across the country. More than 2,000 are in critical condition. And Pakistan says the onus lies on India to create an enabling environment for dialogue between the two countries. In a statement, the foreign minister urged New Delhi to find a peaceful solution to the Kashmir dispute. Shah Mahmood Qureshi said Pakistan will not shy away from dialogue if India reviews its policy on issues. He reiterated Prime Minister Imran Khan's call to take 2 steps towards peace if India takes 1. The foreign minister also lauded the reinforcement of the ceasefire agreement between both countries. Moving on, Pakistan and Iraq have agreed to enhance their military engagements. On his official visit to Iraq, Pakistan's chairman, Joint Chiefs of Staff Committee, met with defense authorities. Pakistan state media says General Nadeem Raza held talks with Iraqi Defense Minister Juma Inad Sadoun Khattab al-Jabouri. He discussed matters of mutual interest with Iraqi Chief of Staff General Abdul Amir Rashid Yar Allah Al-Lami. The chairman also visited Defense University for Higher Military Studies, where he was presented the Guard of Honor. General Raza highlighted the positive role of Pakistan in countering violent extremism. He also shared the country's efforts for regional peace and stability, especially in Afghanistan. And Saudi Arabia has condemned the continued Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. UN envoy Abdulaziz Al-Wasil said Riyadh continues to support the Palestinian cause at all political and economic levels. Al-Wasil said Saudi Arabia adheres to the Arab Peace Initiative proposed by Riyadh and adopted by Arab countries in 2002. He said the initiative affirms the right of Palestinians to obtain an independent state with East Jerusalem as the capital. He also expressed support for the return of refugees and Israel's withdrawal from the occupied Golan Heights. And the Royal Saudi Land Forces have started a joint military exercise with the U.S. in northwest Saudi Arabia. Saudi Foreign Ministry said the Falcon Clause 3 drill aims to strengthen military relations and unify military concepts. The ministry said the exercise will raise the level of readiness and the ability of Saudi forces to work with allies. It added the drill will also prepare the forces against any external threats. The latest Saudi-U.S. military collaboration follows the two-week Falcon Clause 2 exercise. This comes at a time of heightened regional tensions as Yemen's Houthi rebels step up their attacks on the kingdom. Now, Russia says it will react if Bosnia takes steps towards joining NATO. The Russian embassy in Bosnia said Moscow will perceive this move as an act of hostility. The embassy said the purpose of NATO is to fight against Russia. It added that joining NATO will force Sarajevo to take a side in the military-political confrontation. Bosnia and Serbia are the only two Western Balkan countries that remain outside of NATO. Bosnia has long proclaimed integration with NATO and the European Union as strategic goals. But the Bosnian Serbs, who currently chair the country's tripartite presidency, want the country to remain neutral. Meanwhile, Turkey has sent a notification to the Russian forces inside Syria to stop shooting missiles across the border. This came after the Turkish Defense Ministry said rockets fired from Syria fell in its southern Kilis province. It said the Turkish troops in the region have been alerted. The ministry reported no casualties or material damage. Tensions between Turkey and the Russian-backed Syrian government have been running high in recent weeks. Earlier, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan asked Western powers to support Turkey to bring an end to the war in Syria. Lebanon's Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah says he will support a new cabinet if it is announced on Monday. This comes after the prime minister-designate said he will meet with the president on Monday. In a televised address, Nasrallah voiced support for a mix of technocrats and politicians in the new cabinet. He said the country will face problems if the new cabinet seeks to implement the reforms required by the IMF. But Prime Minister-designate Saad Hariri said any new government can only end Lebanon's economic woes by re-engaging with the IMF. Meanwhile, most of the businesses have gone on strike in the country as public anger mounts over the political deadlock. And Air Chief Marshal Zahir Ahmed Babar has assumed command of the Pakistan Air Force. He replaced Air Chief Marshal Mujahid Anwar Khan at the change of command ceremony at Air Headquarters in Islamabad. While addressing the ceremony, the outgoing Air Chief said PAF fulfilled the nation's expectations during Operation Swift Retort. He added that he is proud of leaving the Air Force at the highest level of operational preparedness. He said he is confident that his successor would lead PAF to new heights of excellence. Air Chief Marshal Babar was commissioned in the GDP branch in April 1986. He has served at key operational and administrative positions, including the Deputy Chief of Air Staff. Now, at the United Nations, Pakistan has called for universal and equitable access to safe and clean drinking water for everyone. Pakistan's permanent envoy to the UN, Munir Akram, was speaking at a General Assembly meeting on water security. Akram said water is the source of life and access to it is a fundamental and legal human right. He said Pakistan is proud to be one of the drafters of the joint statement on universal access to affordable drinking water. The ambassador called for scaling up investment in water-related infrastructure to achieve water security by 2030. He said by 2050, more than half of the world's population will be at stake due to the scarcity of water. The statement was co-signed by 161 countries. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres says Pakistan is a fundamental partner of the United Nations. Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi spoke to the UN chief over the phone. In a statement, the Foreign Office said Qureshi and Guterres exchanged views on the COVID-19 crisis. They discussed post-pandemic economic recovery, international debt relief, and availability of vaccines in developing countries. They also mulled the latest developments regarding Indian-occupied Jammu and Kashmir and the Afghan peace process. The statement adds the two sides agreed that an inclusive political solution can bring durable peace to Afghanistan. More stories after a short break. Stay with us. We're back. Tanzania's Vice President, Samia Suluhu Hassan, has become the first woman president of the country. Hassan took the oath at the State House in the country's commercial capital, Dar es Salaam. She assumes the office following the death of President John Magufuli. In her first address as the president, Hassan called for unity and said the country needs to bury its differences. Hassan is also the country's first president born in Zanzibar, the archipelago that forms part of the Union of the Republic of Tanzania. In Australia, mice have been swarming the western New South Wales country town of Gilgandra for several weeks. Locals say this is the worst mice plague in decades. Eyewitness video shows thousands of rodents swarming around a local farm. Farming communities have been hit the hardest by the uptick in mice. Local media says supermarkets are storing food in sealed containers and 3 patients at the hospital were bitten. Intensive baiting programs are being tried with little signs of keeping the vermin numbers down. So locals are hoping for heavy rain to drown the mice in their burrows. China's Chang'e 5 lunar probe has successfully entered the halo orbit around the Sun-Earth Lagrangian Point 1. Beijing Aerospace Control Center said the orbiter is in normal working condition. Control Center's chief said a team will carry out tests of the orbiter to provide support for the follow-up space exploration missions. It said the orbiter is now 936,700 kilometers away from Earth. Chang'e 5 has become China's first spacecraft in the halo orbit. It will remain in the orbit with a cycle of about 6 months. Also, NASA has completed a test of engines on a Boeing-built rocket for Artemis missions that could take humans back to the moon. NASA conducted the test to simulate a launch by firing the engines while being anchored to a tower at its space center in Mississippi. The Space Launch System rocket is now expected to go to Florida for integration with Lockheed Martin's Orion spacecraft. The hot fire is the final test of the Green Run series to ensure the core stage of the rocket is ready to launch Artemis missions to the moon. Artemis 1 is scheduled to orbit the moon with an uncrewed spacecraft in November. Britain's late Princess Diana's handwritten and typed letters have gone up for sale at an auction house in Cornwall, England. Her 40 letters between 1990 and 1997 to a friend, Roger Bramble, make up part of the 36 lots on sale. More details in this report.
Many people have impacted the world, but the legacy left by Princess Diana Spencer is unmatchable. It is no wonder why even 23 years after her demise, she continues to be remembered fondly. David Lay Auctions say they have received interest in her letters from around the world, including the United States and India.
I think it meant a lot to her to stay in touch with people she really cared about. And she opened up to Roger about Lucia Fleischer de Lima, for example, who was a woman who was close to her mother's age. And I think Diana liked maternal figures, really, people she could seek guidance from and counsel. I think the letter showed that just her friends were a small number of friends were absolutely key to, probably to her sanity, actually.
The auction house's research manager says the individual lots could fetch a total of around $42,000. Mimi Connell-Lay said reading the letters had made her change her previously indifferent opinion of Diana.
I get a sense of a real continuity. You know, she stayed a warm, loyal, affectionate person no matter what else was going on. And obviously we know that that period was a period of enormous turmoil in her life. She separated from Charles, they got divorced, all sorts of things happened during that time. And yet her relationship with Roger, who they were written to, obviously was a constant.
Proceeds from the sale will go to organizations with which the Princess and Bramble had a particular affinity. This includes the English National Ballet and the Young Musicians Symphony Orchestra.
And now for the latest in business. European markets have edged down after a spike in bond yields prompted a sell-off in global stocks. London's FTSE, Italy's FTSE MIB, and the CAC 40 in Paris have all slipped over 0.5%. The Pan-European Stock 600 and Frankfurt DAX have also shed marginally. Earlier, Asian stocks also declined after an overnight sell-off at the Wall Street. For the latest updates, you can follow us on social media at indus.news.